In the grand theater of history, some conflicts drag on for years, shaping generations through a slow grind of attrition. But sometimes history holds its breath, and in a few short, violent days, the world is irrevocably changed. Today, we journey back to one such moment, a pivotal and deeply controversial chapter, the Six-Day War of 1967. It was a war that, in less than a week, redrew the geographical and political map of the Middle East. In just 6 days, the State of Israel defeated the combined armies of 3 major Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It was a military victory of such speed and precision that it left the world stunned. We will now try to understand in detail how this happened. How was such a swift, such a decisive victory even possible? To truly grasp the events of 1967, we must first rewind the clock. The region was a tinderbox, and the embers of previous conflicts, from the War of 1948 to the Suez Crisis of 1956, had never truly cooled. In fact, the tensions were escalating on multiple fronts. There was the festering issue of Palestinian refugees, a problem unresolved since 1948. Millions of Palestinians lived in camps across Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, and their calls to return to their homes were growing louder. The borders themselves were never quiet. Cross-border raids by Palestinian commandos, or Fedayeen, into Israeli territory were a constant feature, always met with Israeli reprisals. It was a cycle of low-level violence that kept the frontiers perpetually on edge. Amidst this, the anti-Israel sentiment among the Arab populace was incredibly intense. And at the heart of this volatile atmosphere was one man,
Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser. At that time, Nasser was the undisputed champion of pan-Arab nationalism, the powerful ideology that sought to unite all Arabs as a single nation. He was seen as a hero across the Arab world, and he aspired to lead a united Arab front against Israel. This was the backdrop of simmering tensions, ideological clashes, and the rising influence of Nasser. Then, suddenly, events began to spiral out of control. In May 1967, the situation took a dramatic turn, sparked by a piece of flawed intelligence provided by the Soviet Union. This report, later proven to be false, claimed that Israel was massing troops on its border to launch a major invasion of Syria. But at that moment, President Nasser believed it. In response to the report, Nasser initiated a series of bold and aggressive moves. He began
deploying a massive number of Egyptian troops and tanks into the Sinai Peninsula, right up to Israel's border. He then took an even bigger step. He ordered the United Nations Peacekeeping Force, which had been acting as a buffer in the Sinai for a decade, to withdraw immediately. The buffer zone was gone. But it was his next step that would prove to be the most fateful. Nasser announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to all Israeli shipping. The Straits of Tiran, located between Egypt and Saudi Arabia at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba, were Israel's only maritime route to its southern port of Eilat. For Israel, this was not just a blockade, it was an economic strangulation, a direct threat to its very survival. They considered it an act of war, or what is known in international law as a casus belli, a justification for war.
The stage was now set. With tensions at their absolute peak and fiery rhetoric coming from both sides, the morning of June 5, 1967 arrived. On that day, Israel struck first. It launched a preemptive, utterly unexpected, and devastating aerial assault, codenamed Operation Focus. This, more than anything else, would prove to be the decisive moment of the entire war. In the early hours of the morning, the Israeli Air Force launched simultaneous attacks on air bases across Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and even Iraq. How was this possible? How could they strike so many targets at once? And weren't the Arab air forces ready? This was a masterstroke of intelligence and execution. Israel's intelligence agency Mossad had gathered astonishingly detailed information. They knew the exact locations of Egyptian aircraft, the patrol schedule,
even the times when the pilots would be having their breakfast.
Israeli pilots flew their jets extremely low, hugging the contours of the Mediterranean Sea and the desert, staying under the radar. They reached the Egyptian airfields virtually undetected and unleashed their attack. In the first 3 hours of the war, the vast majority of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground before it ever had a chance to take off. Adding to the disaster, it's widely reported that at the very moment of the attack, Egypt's air defense system had been temporarily shut down. This was because Egypt's highest-ranking military commander, Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amr, was flying to visit his troops in the Sinai, and his plane was in the air. It was a catastrophic failure. The result was absolute. Within a matter of hours, the air
forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were all but annihilated. Israel had achieved complete and total air supremacy.
With the skies clear of any threat, the focus shifted to the ground. Israeli ground forces began to advance on 3 fronts. The first and largest was against Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula. Though the Egyptian army had a large presence in the Sinai, they were unprepared for the sheer speed and ferocity of the Israeli blitz. Israeli tanks and armored columns smashed through the Egyptian defensive lines, advancing deep into the desert. The Egyptian command structure, already reeling from the air attacks, began to collapse. Communications were severed, and then from his headquarters in Cairo, Field Marshal Amir made an incredibly controversial and disastrous decision. He issued a general order for the entire Egyptian army in the Sinai to conduct a full, immediate, and chaotic retreat. It was an order given without a plan. The retreat turned into a rout. The disorganized Egyptian columns, stretching for miles across the open desert, became easy targets for the Israeli Air Force and advancing ground troops. The losses sustained during the retreat were immense. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. It's estimated that nearly 80% of Egypt's military hardware was either destroyed or fell into Israeli hands. Within a few days, Israeli forces had reached the banks of the Suez Canal. They had also captured Sharm el-Sheikh, the strategic point controlling the Straits of Tiran, which were now reopened. It was a total and complete defeat on the Sinai front. Now we turn to the second front, Jordan, the West Bank, and
The city of Jerusalem. Initially, Jordan's King Hussein had been reluctant to enter the war. However, swayed by wildly inaccurate and exaggerated reports of success coming from Cairo and immense pressure from Nasser, he made the fateful decision to join the fight. On the afternoon of June 5th, Jordanian artillery began shelling Israeli-controlled West Jerusalem and areas near Tel Aviv. Israel's response was swift and powerful. Its forces launched a full-scale assault into the Jordanian-controlled West Bank and began to encircle East Jerusalem. The fighting for Jerusalem was particularly fierce. The city is sacred to all 3 faiths, and battles for positions like Ammunition Hill and the area around the Old City were bloody and hard-fought. The Jordanian army fought bravely, but they were outmatched in numbers and weaponry, and critically, they had no air cover. On June 7th, the 3rd day of the war, Israeli paratroopers broke through and entered the Old City, fighting their way to the Western Wall. It was a profoundly symbolic moment, broadcast to the world. By then, the entire West Bank had fallen under Israeli control. Jordan's army had suffered a devastating blow. With Egypt and Jordan defeated, the third front remained: Syria and the Golan Heights. This front fully erupted relatively late in the war, on June 9th, the 5th day. The Golan Heights were a formidable natural fortress for Syria. From these commanding heights, with their steep cliffs and heavy fortifications, the Syrian army had regularly shelled Israeli settlements below. An assault here would be difficult for Israel. But Syria had its own weaknesses. A military coup shortly before the war had left its military leadership unstable. And, like the others, it had no air force left to support its ground troops. The Israeli strategy was methodical.
First, the Israeli Air Force subjected the Syrian fortifications to intense and relentless bombing to soften up the defenses. Then, the ground troops, aided by combat engineers who cleared paths through the minefields, began the difficult uphill assault. The fighting was intense, but ultimately, the Israeli forces managed to break through the Syrian lines. Here, too, command and control failures played a part. There are reports of confusion within the Syrian High Command and the spread of false information. For instance, the news of the fall of Quneitra, the main city on the Golan, was broadcast prematurely, which shattered the morale of the defending Syrian soldiers.
June 10th. Israel had captured most of the strategic plateau. That evening, a UN-brokered ceasefire finally took hold. The 6 days of fighting were over. If we summarize the reasons for this lightning-fast Israeli victory, several key factors stand out. The most important, without a doubt, was that initial preemptive airstrike, which paralyzed the Arab air forces from the very first hours. Second was the superiority of Israeli intelligence. They knew their enemy's capabilities and dispositions in minute detail. Third were the grave failures in the Arab High Command, particularly in Egypt and Syria, which were plagued by a lack of coordination, flawed planning, contradictory orders, and disastrous interference by political leadership in military matters. In stark contrast, the Israeli military was better trained, had modern and effective war doctrine, and displayed brilliant coordination between its army, air force, and navy. Their morale was sky high. This wasn't merely a victory of technology. It was a victory of strategy, intelligence, training, and leadership. The war itself lasted only 6 days, but its consequences are still being felt today. The immediate results were seismic. Territorially, Israel's size more than tripled. From Egypt, it captured the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. From Jordan, it took the entire West Bank, including the historic Old City of East Jerusalem. And from Syria, it seized the strategically vital Golan Heights. The human price was immense. The war created a new wave of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, and millions more Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza suddenly found their home and lives under Israeli military occupation. In the Arab world, the war is known as the Al-Naqsa, or the setback. It was a humiliating and traumatic blow to the dream of pan-Arab nationalism, and to President Nasser personally, sparking a period of intense soul-searching and disillusionment. The war radically shifted the balance of power in the region, establishing Israel as the dominant military force. It also reshaped the entire Arab-Israeli conflict, creating the new central problem of the occupied territories. The formula of land for peace, which would dominate diplomacy for decades, was born directly out of this war. Indeed, the core issues that define the Middle East conflict today, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the status of Jerusalem, the Palestinian refugees, the control of the Golan Heights, legacies of the 1967 war. It is a sobering thought that just 6 days of history, less than 1 week, could cast such a long and heavy shadow over the next half-century and beyond. The war didn't just change maps. It altered the destinies of millions of people. This brings us to a final, profound question that historians and analysts still debate. Did this stunning, decisive military victory for Israel pave the way for long-term peace? Or did it deepen the animosity and sow the seeds for future wars? The answer is complex. On one hand, the new reality eventually led to peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. But on the other hand, the military occupation and the unresolved Palestinian question have fueled decades of conflict and given rise to new forms of resistance. Perhaps in the end, both are true. It was a war that ended in 6 days, but the struggle it defined continues to this very day.